So this week we're going to be talking about Fraga's sense and reference. And what we're going to see in this paper is that Fraga is arguing for a picture that's kind of similar to the million picture from last time. He's going to say that in addition to standing for things or referring to things, words also have this extra dimension to their meaning, which he calls the sense of a word. And the sense of a word is fairly similar to what Mill was talking about when he talked about the word's connotation. However, Frege is going to be different from Mill in that he's going to think that actually sense applies to everything. Every word has a sense, as well as a possible reference. And he's going to be very focused on names, and he's going to give us a new kind of argument. In addition to the ones that we were talking about in class, he's going to give us a new kind of argument for thinking that names have senses as well as reference. So this lecture is going to be broken down into a number of parts. Before we even get into Frege's argument, I'm going to present this principle called the principle of compositionality. Now, Frege never explicitly actually talks about this principle. However, when I explain it to you, I think it will be reasonably obvious that he actually relies on this principle in his argument. And so it's going to be helpful for you to see what it is to really understand how the argument is supposed to work. After we do that, we're then going to move on to presenting Frege's argument against the million picture of names. And his argument is going to center completely on names for objects that turn out to be the same. What do we want to say about names where we have two different names and we discover that they're names for the same thing? And he's going to argue that the million theory has problems explaining what's going on when we have two names that seem to mean different things, and yet it turns out they're names for the same object. Frege's theory of sense is designed exactly to try and solve this problem. He introduces the idea of sense as well as reference to explain how two names can have different meanings even when they refer to the same thing. The solution, he thinks, is that they have different senses. Even though two names might be names for the same thing, as part of their meaning, they include different ways of thinking about the objects. Now, this theory, described in the way I have, might seem kind of similar to some of the ideas we talked about already. And indeed, when you first start thinking about sense, it looks an awful lot like what Locke was thinking about when he was talking about words standing for ideas. But we're going to see that Frege really doesn't like this idea that senses should be thought about as ideas, and he wants to try and give us a different picture of how this works. So to try and understand this, we're going to look in more detail at Frege's analogy with the telescope to try and see how exactly he thought senses were different from ideas. The last thing we're going to do then is we're going to talk about a further application of Frege's theory. This isn't one that's explicitly in the text, although there are various things he says which make me think that Frege really was thinking about this. So we're first going to see an additional problem for the million view of names. We're going to think about what happens when a word names something that fails to exist. What should we say about names in cases like that? We're going to see that the theory that Mill gave us, that the meaning of a word is just what it stands for, that runs into problems when we have names that refer to things that don't exist, because if the thing doesn't exist, well then how does the word mean anything at all? It seems like Frege thinks that we can explain what's going on here using sense and reference. We can say, well, even when names fail to refer, they can still have senses, and for that reason can still be meaningful and have different meanings to other names. However, we will finish by wondering whether that actually really holds up. We'll ask, given what Frege told us sense is supposed to be like, whether it really makes sense to think of a word as being able to have a sense without a referent.